In 1996, California voters passed Proposition 215, allowing physicians to recommend marijuana for medical purposes. To date, as I understand, 10 states have enacted medical marijuana legislation that is actually being implemented. And a total of 36 states in the District of Columbia have formally recognized in various ways the value of medical marijuana. A year ago, the Ninth Circuit, U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that doctors have a constitutional right to discuss marijuana with their patients. However, refusing to accept the will of the electorate, the federal government has been fighting back. Earlier this year, Oakland resident Ed Rosenthal was the central target of the federal government's campaign to destroy legal medical marijuana in California. The case and subsequent verdict against Rosenthal was based on withholding key information from the jury, including the fact that Mr. Rosenthal had been deputized by the city of Oakland under California law, specifically to attend to the seriously ill. In the case, Mr. Rosenthal faced a sentence of 60 years in federal prison. However, facing subsequent public outrage about the case, including a public protest by the jurors themselves, the presiding judge handed down a sentence of only 1 day in jail and a nominal fine. But Ed Rosenthal remains a convicted felon who is currently seeking to have his sentence overturned in a state with 3 strikes and you're out. Interestingly enough, in the current recall election in California, all of the major candidates from across the political spectrum, including those that have dropped out, have endorsed the legality of medical marijuana. How times change. Clearly, this is a reflection of the fact that over 70% of the public supports medical marijuana. Not to be discouraged, however, the Department of Justice has since asked the U.S. Supreme Court to allow it to punish medical doctors who recommend marijuana, and the DEA continues to raid and close down clinics. Meanwhile, Congressman Barney Frank and Sam Farr have each submitted bills respectively to reduce the federal classification of marijuana, to decriminalize its medicinal use, and to allow defendants in federal cases to claim compliance with state laws. Unfortunately, neither bill probably has much chance yet of passage. There are many questions to ask about federal policies, state policies, who benefits, who loses. Is California leading the nation? What kind of views are actually being presented and based on what? And what about the lives of the people who are suffering from cancer, AIDS, MS, and many other serious ailments? What happens to them in the meantime? Our independent policy forum this evening assembles several of the foremost experts to discuss the past, present, and future of medical marijuana. So I'd like to introduce our speakers. Please hold your applause until I complete the introduction. First, to my left, your right, is Ed Rosenthal, the noted activist and best-selling author who's been a key pioneer, as you all know, of the movement for medical marijuana. In 30 years of study, writing, and activism, he's become a trusted expert on marijuana use and social policy. He's also co-author of the important book which you're featuring this evening called Why Marijuana Should Be Legal, and there are copies on the front table. And he's written over a dozen other books on the subject. To his left, again your right, is Donald Abrams. Ron McCune. Rob is Professor of Law and Public Policy at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley, and co-author of the other book that we are featuring this evening called Drug War Heresies from Cambridge University Press. He was formerly a behavioral scientist at the Institute for Civil Justice and the Drug Policy Research Center at RAND Corporation. He's one of the world's foremost authorities on drug policy. To my right is Edwin Dobb. Ed is contributing editor to Harper's Magazine. His writings on civil liberties have been published in Harper's, Amnesty Now, and San Francisco Magazine. He was formerly senior editor of The Sciences. He writes for New York Times Magazine and is a visiting lecturer at the Graduate School of Journalism, also at UC Berkeley. Finally, I want to introduce, to his right, your left again, Donald Abrams. Don is Professor of Clinical Medicine at the University of California here in San Francisco and one of the leading researchers in the world on medical marijuana. He's also Assistant Director of the AIDS Program at San Francisco General Hospital, and since 1981 has been involved in several landmark studies on HIV and AIDS. He's conducted clinical trials of marijuana since 1997, including trials with grants from the National Institute of Health. So please join with me in welcoming our speakers. Before we begin, a couple of quick program matters I want to mention. After our discussion, we will have questions from the audience. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Ed Rosenthal.
First thing, I'd like to thank the Independent Institute for sponsoring this forum and creating it, and I think that this is pretty incredible, and especially you, David, and also Bill Sandover, who's here. They've just done so much work in getting this together. Inspiring. And I'd like to thank everybody who's here, and in fact the entire community, because the reason why I am here and can be here tonight is because I was only given a one-day sentence, and that is because of you. It wasn't because of the judge, it wasn't because of, you know, any of the legal things. It was because of the pressure that the community and the media placed on the court system. So I'd like to give you a hearty thanks for that. Now, this issue, the issue of medical marijuana, is of prime importance to perhaps 100,000 Californians who use marijuana in one way or another for their health, who have been given recommendations by doctors, and it may improve the quality of their life, it may maintain their health, or it may actually keep them alive. And so this is not just a ruse issue or something like that. And this issue not only affects Californians, but also throughout the nation. And there are probably somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people who use marijuana medically, whether or not they have a recommendation for it. Now, I'd like to go into a little bit about my case. As you know, I was convicted on 3 counts, and that is cultivating marijuana, maintaining a place where marijuana is cultivated, and also conspiracy to cultivate marijuana. And as you know, this was a result of a jury that was kept ignorant of the facts of the case, that I was deputized by the city of Oakland, that I was providing medical marijuana, that I was told by the city that I was immune from prosecution. And once a jury found this out, when they went home and read the newspapers that they hadn't been reading while they were jurors, within hours they got back to the media and repudiated their sentence. And of course that did not have a judicial meaning, but it certainly had a meaning to the media, and it certainly had a meaning to the public. Because, you know, this case was not fought just on one level. It was fought on 2 levels, and that is, it was fought in the court, and so far we're losing the court case, but in the court of public opinion, we're the winners. And I want to mention something. You know, most of us, you know, when we vote, we realize we're minority voters in one way or another. We vote for all these candidates that don't win quite a bit of the time, and we vote for causes that seem to be lost causes, but we're the majority. When it comes to medical marijuana, we are the majority. Anybody who's opposed to it, they're in the minority. It's a very unusual position to be in, at least for me, and for most of us, I think. But we have to realize that we're not trying to convince people that medical marijuana is efficacious or that it works or that it should be legal. We're just trying to convince a few politicians of it who are being wagged by the tail, and I'll get into that. Actually, 8 of the jurors repudiated the verdict, two of the alternates. This had never happened before in American history. Now, I notice that it's heating up because the jury in the Oakland case, 6 members of the jury in the Oakland case complained that I'm talking about the Riders case, have just complained about what happened in their jury. So 4 days after the jury convicted me, they were back in the courtroom in the audience section for the judge to look at while he was deciding whether I was going to be remanded into custody immediately. Now, I know that most of you were very relieved that I was given only a 1-day sentence 6 months later, but I was more ambivalent about it because, well, you know, it's pretty good getting a 1-day sentence, and actually the government owes me 12 hours because I served 36 hours. But let's say they had given me 5 years and remanded me to prison right then and there. You know, it would have been a lot more headlines. I would have had a book sold by now on this. And I think it would have moved the laws. And I think that the government and the judge realized that if he had done that, that it would have caused quite a bit more, I'm going to just use the word controversy. Right now, the government is appealing my sentence. And they want me to do the 21 months or 5 years or whatever. And I'm appealing the conviction both on technical and on constitutional grounds. And I wanted to go through them because they're of importance. And the first is that the judge, in pretrial, the judge was looking at the search warrant, and he realized that the DEA agent, Pickett, had lied on the search warrant. So instead of allowing a withering cross-examination, he said, well, I'm just going to excise certain parts of the search warrant. And what was left after he excised everything was that I had a high electric bill. And then my attorney said, well, let's compare it with other electric bills in the area. And the judge said, I'm not going to allow it because there are industrial users in the area, and then the search warrant might not be good. So we're appealing on that basis. Then we're appealing because the judge found that the prosecutor had actually lied to the grand jury. And the judge found that he had misled the grand jury. But the judge said that no harm was done. And I don't know, if we had lied, if one of you had lied to the grand jury, you would be up for perjury. And here the prosecutor is lying to the grand jury. And he shouldn't have even been testifying. So those are the 2 technical grounds that we're appealing on. And we may very well win on those grounds. If we win, for instance, on the first one, it would mean that the way that search warrants are looked at would change. It would change, it would have court precedent there. But there are other more important issues that we're covering. And I'm going to go through these very quickly. The first is the 9th Amendment. Now, you know, the 9th Amendment has never been used in court work, or it's been used very little. Even the Griswold decision, which was for birth control, and the abortion decisions did not rely on the 9th Amendment. And what the 9th Amendment says is that those rights of the people that are not enumerated in the Constitution remain with the people and shall not be denigrated. That means, like, for instance, you have the right to eat strawberries. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that you have an inherent right to eat strawberries, but you have it because it's been there. Those are some of your natural rights. And there are 2 natural rights that the 9th Amendment covers in this case. And the first is that you have a right to seek health. everybody has a right to seek health in their own way, whether you want to use herbal supplements, or whether you want to use vitamins, or whether you want to use religion and prayer for your health. You have a right to determine how you will gain your health. And so by restricting medical marijuana, the government is restricting your right to health. And then the second part is this. Before the Constitution, people in the United States had the right to use marijuana. And then, up until 1937, there were no federal laws against marijuana. So that was 150 years that people were using, approximately 150 years during the United States that people were using marijuana. Then in 1937, the government realized that in order to restrict marijuana, it would have to pass a constitutional amendment. So instead, they passed a tax law that was confiscatory. It was a $100 an ounce tax, which in 1937 was a lot, since an ounce only cost a couple of dollars. So people would be arrested not for possessing marijuana, but for not possessing the tax stamp or paying the taxes on the substance. And it wasn't until 1968 that marijuana was made illegal. I believe that that's unconstitutional. People had the right to use marijuana through that entire period of time, and it was only in 1968 that it was made illegal. Well, if people had the right to use it, then that was a constitutional right. How can that be denied? And years ago, I wrote a paper that said that the Ninth Amendment is probably going to be the amendment of the 21st century, and I hope this is the first case on it. Then the 10th Amendment, that's our states' rights amendment, that any rights not given to the federal government remain with the states. And the state has two basic rights, one in this area. One is to regulate the health of its citizens, and the other is to regulate doctors. So the federal government is violating these rights in terms of the 10th Amendment. And where this comes in, especially in my particular case, is in the Constitution, and these are interwoven, but in the Commerce Clause of the Constitution that regulates interstate commerce. Well, look, this marijuana was grown in California by Californians, for Californians. It was recommended by California doctors for people to use in California. I fail to see where there's any interstate commerce. So if there's no interstate commerce, and the state has the right to regulate health, and it's already determined that marijuana is good medicine, then why is the federal government in here at all? And then another issue is 885D. And 885D says that it's a federal law, and it's part of the Controlled Substances Act, and it says that if you're a federal, state, or city health or safety officer, and you're in the course of your business, you're dealing with controlled substances, you're immune from prosecution. Well, that's so that narcs can buy and sell pot and other drugs and not get arrested for it. And I was a health and safety officer that the city of Oakland had appointed, and I was told by the city attorney's office that I was immune from prosecution under this law. So that, Judge Breyer said that a literal reading of this would seem to immunize Rosenthal from prosecution. But then he said, I'm not going to allow that, and then he didn't allow the jury to hear it. And then there's the other thing. Let's say the city attorney was wrong. Let's say the city attorney's office was totally wrong, and they had told me that I was immune from prosecution, but I wasn't. Well, then I should have been immune from prosecution because of estoppel, which means that if you're told that something that you're doing is okay by the federal government, they can't then come in and say, look, it isn't right, you're breaking the law and you're under arrest. And that's the idea of estoppel. So needless to say, I was a little surprised when I was arrested. And as you know, I never felt guilty. I'll tell you why I did this. You know, first of all, I'm a successful writer, which is pretty unusual in America, and I own my own publishing company. And so I'm upper middle class or a middle class person, and I did not have to get involved in this. This was not my source of income. And the reason why I got involved in it was because the city of Oakland asked me to help patients. And, you know, there are all kinds of sins in life, and we read about most of them that come out of the Ten Commandments in the daily papers, you know, based on lust, greed, robbery, lying, just basically the administration basic. So you look at that, but then there are other sins too, and sort of sins of omission. When you see somebody who needs help and you say, I'm not going to render that person help, that's a sin. That's a sin as much as lusting after somebody else's wife or husband or whatever. So I felt, you know, I was living with this, and then when the city said, well, you have immunity, well, I had no excuse not to do it. And then there were personal things like, let's see, I can legally grow pot. Just the thought of that. You know, I should say that, you know, they say that the federal government says that pot's addictive. Well, I don't think that marijuana is really addictive, but growing it is. And so when I was given the opportunity to legally grow marijuana, I jumped at that. So anyway, so given that, given all these circumstances, it was inevitable that when I was arrested, that I would be fighting this. And I had just read a book a few months before I was arrested called The Tipping Point, which talks about movements and how movements form and how little things make big changes in society. And I think I was really fortunate in reading this book because it gave me insight into what was going to happen to me, what was happening to me, and what was going to happen to this issue. And after all of this, you know, the one thing that this did was change the paradigm in the way that people think about marijuana and that the way the press reports it. And this is exactly what the federal government was afraid of. This is what they've been trying to stop. And their doing this actually made me into a much better activist than I've ever been. You know, one of my ironic thoughts is that for 35 years I was trying to think, well, what would make me a more effective activist? How can I be a more effective activist? How can I get this into the media so I could be speaking at places like the Independent Institute instead of at mass rallies and things? So, and the federal government found it out for me. And, you know, so let this be a warning. You better be careful what you wish for. So, now, the real question is, why does the federal government want to do this? What do they have in it? What's their vested interest in this? And I want to go into I have two ideas about this. The first is that they really hate marijuana more than any other drug, whether it's legal or illegal. And the reason for that, whether you're talking about tobacco, alcohol, amphetamines, cocaine, heroin, all of those drugs ultimately make you dysfunctional in one way or another, or can kill you, you know. And the problem with marijuana, as far as the police are concerned, is that there is no payback to the people. They don't get any dysfunction from it. They might be happier than the police are. It doesn't fit the Puritan ethic that if you have enjoyment, that in some way you have to pay for it. And I think, in a way, that's the psychology of the police. But there's something much more important, that the whole criminal justice industry is based on arrests and on catching criminals. And so if you decriminalized or regulated marijuana, then 8% of their budget would be down the drain. 8% of their budget. 1 out of every 12 arrests. 1 out of every 12 jails, 1 out of every 12 cop cars, 1 out of every 12 judges. It goes on and on down the line, so that we're talking about a tremendous amount of money. And the marijuana war cost the federal government and the federal government and the state governments, that means us, really, somewhere between $15 and $30 billion a year. And I'll give you some quick statistics on that. There are about 730,000 people who were arrested for marijuana last year, 88% of them for simple possession. There are probably between 100 and 150,000 people in prison right now for marijuana. There are 20,000 people in federal prison for marijuana right now. It costs the government $1.5 billion just to house that small town of 20,000 people. Half of those people are Hispanic, so that there are 10,000 Hispanic people in prison, in federal prison, just for marijuana. And, so if you can think of how much resources is spent on that, it's incredible. So let's give a hypothetical. Let's say tomorrow everybody stopped using illegal drugs, or let's say they just stopped using marijuana. Everybody stopped using marijuana. So the police went out to arrest people. There was nobody to arrest. Nobody was selling marijuana on the street. Nobody was using it in their homes. It wasn't being used. It would be disaster for the DEA. Could you imagine that? Now look, DEA has had a pretty good growth period over the last 65 years. In 1937, when the tax stamp came in, there were estimated to be 55,000 users. Last year there were 730,000 arrests. That's about 13, the arrests totaled 13 times the number of users when marijuana was originally regulated. There are 25 million users for the feds and state authorities to poach upon. They've had a tremendous success. If you take a look at these statistics, statistical impossibility is going to happen sometime around 2020, where there'll actually be more marijuana users in the United States than there are people. So, let's see. Now, I wanted to step back for a moment from this and get into what this is all about. And, let's say we were talking about a river and how we were going to use this river. And, there'd be all the stakeholders in this river and the water that this river provided would get together and talk about it. You might have farmers and urban people and urban communities and environmentalists, and maybe there would be fishermen might get involved in it. And together they'd reach some sort of compromise that probably nobody would like, but that everybody could live with or sort of live with. So let's look at the stakeholders in terms of medical marijuana. Well, you have the patients, you have the doctors, you have the providers, you have caregivers, you have manufacturers, and all of these people have something to lend to the discussion. You have the Public Health Service, they might have something to say about it. All insurers might have something to say about it because they might have to pay for it. But where are the police in this? Where's the criminal justice system in this? What's their stake in this? They claim to have a stake in that. What do they have a right to poach upon people, to poach upon sick people? Just what is their stake in it? And this is the problem. Their stake in this is arrest. They need arrest, or else they can't justify their budgets. And that's what this whole thing is all about. And that's why this is we will hear later that this is a culture war, and this is part of the culture war, whether they have a right to arrest a certain group of people because they're using this substance just so that they can arrest them. Can you imagine all of the wasted resources of this. The thousands and thousands of people whose lives are being ruined. 750,000 people were arrested, 730,000 people were arrested last year. That doesn't affect just 730,000 people. It affects millions of people. It affects their families. It affects their employers. It might affect their employees. It affects them if they're college students, because they lose all federal ability for federal grants. So that 730,000 arrests, and it doesn't stop at the end of the year. Okay, this 730,000 is processed, we'll do the next. It continues all their lives. They might lose professional licenses. They might lose the ability to continue with their education. So when we step back and we see who are the stakeholders, here's what I think. The police, the criminal justice system is not a stakeholder in whether medical marijuana patients should be able to use marijuana, or how much they should be able to use, or how they should be able to grow it. They have absolutely no expertise in this area. Any expertise that they claim to have is negated by their official organization. And their official organization is the California Narcotics Officers Association. You can go onto the internet and look at their position papers, and here's what they say. Marijuana is not a medicine. These people are verbal terrorists. Now, the reason why I say they're verbal terrorists, in order to remain a police officer in California, you have to continually get education. You have to take educational classes. And the California Narcotics Officers Association is deputized to give some of these classes. So this is what they're teaching their students, which is police, that marijuana isn't a medicine, that anybody who's using it is using it as a ruse. Don't believe it. Bust them now and let the court sort it out. And they're giving a training session in case anybody, on November 8th through 13th. I'm going to try and register for it. And so they're saying in this, they say that the people who are supporting medical marijuana are just doing it as a means of pushing marijuana onto the public, you know, so that this is a first step. This is the only thing that I agree with them about, that medical marijuana is only a first step, because everybody has a right to use it, whether they're using it medically or recreationally or however they want to use it. And I know that now people will say, now the Narcotics Officers Association will say, well, that's exactly what we said. But let's get real. Does the federal government differentiate between medical marijuana and recreational marijuana? There's no differentiation in the law. And in fact, what do they tell the juries? No matter what the state law might be, the federal government doesn't recognize medical marijuana. So you have this Narcotics Officers Association functioning as verbal terrorists in this war. And then they want to sit down at the table with stakeholders and say, well, we're stakeholders in it too. But I question, where is their stake in it? And I'll give you one example of how this played out very recently. There was recently the Vasconcellos bill, which former Governor Davis is going to decide whether he's going to sign or not. Part of the reason he's going to be former Governor Davis is because he was always apathetic and actually anti-marijuana and anti-medical marijuana. And maybe if he had a little more empathy for a few sick people, he wouldn't be in the terrible position that he's in. But okay, so anyway, this Vasconcellos bill, what this bill originally said, it adopted the SAM, the Sonoma guidelines, which were 99 plants and 100 or 200 square feet. Well, after it was ready to go right into the Senate, what happened was Lockyer got a hold of Vasconcellos and they changed it to 6 plants. Now, what expertise does Lockyer have about what 6 plants will produce? What does he know about medicine? Why was he even involved in it? Don't you think it's up for the people of this state to make policy, and then for the Attorney General and the district attorneys to follow that policy and for the police to follow it, rather than for the tail to wag the dog? That's where it's at. We have a police department that is out of control. And I have to get off, but there's one last part of this, which is, if you look at the Oakland Narcotics Bureau, where do you think they're housed? They're not in the Oakland Police Building. They're not at City Hall. They're not in any of their own building. No, they have a space in the federal building. And narcotics divisions all over the country are becoming part of the national police. They're being directed more by the federal government than by their local police chiefs, and they are now becoming part of the anti-terror network, and that's what we're dealing with. We have a big job ahead of us, but we will win this. Here's something for us all to say and think about. These laws are doomed. Thank you.
One thing I might just add as a footnote to what Ed's been saying is there's a school of economics that we use it in part at the Independent Institute called the School of Public Choice. And public choice economists are very well aware of what Ed is talking about as far as the incentives that police agencies have in fostering and actually criminalizing behavior for their own benefit. I want to thank Ed for a wonderful presentation. Our next speaker is Donald Abrams.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about how I got into this field of doing research on marijuana. It's been a path that's been ongoing for the past 11 years. It started in 1992. I am an AIDS doctor, as was mentioned. I'm also newly appointed the chief of hematology oncology at San Francisco General Hospital. So I take care of patients with cancer and patients with AIDS, and that's what I've been doing during my career. In 1992, the AIDS conference was being held in all places in Amsterdam. And I was in my hotel room, some of you understand that, yes, glancing at CNN when I noticed Mary Rathbun was being arrested. Mary was a volunteer in our clinic at San Francisco General Hospital. She was about 70. She was known as Brownie Mary. She won the Volunteer of the Year award 2 years running because she came and took our patients to x-ray and took their blood to the lab and picked up their prescriptions. And she also baked brownies for her kids. And here I was in Amsterdam watching Brownie Mary being arrested in Sonoma for baking her brownies. When I got back home, there was a letter addressed to the director of research at the AIDS program at San Francisco General Hospital. Somebody brought it to me thinking I was a good enough person to respond to it, and it was from Rick Doblin, who's the president of the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS. Rick is a graduate of a PhD graduate of the Harvard School of Government, and his particular interest is in drug policy reform. And Rick suggested that a clinical trial demonstrating the medicinal benefit of marijuana should come from Brownie Mary's institution, as if she were our dean or something. Well, 1992 was a bad year for people living with HIV because we really had no drugs. We only had 3, and I had just finished a trial comparing the 3 of them. So as a clinical trialist, this was sort of a gauntlet that I decided should be picked up. So I began to develop a clinical trial to look at smoked marijuana in patients with the so-called AIDS wasting syndrome, a very common condition at the time where patients lost weight, became very skeletal, had diarrhea, no appetite. And marijuana is something that these patients were using to a large extent, obtaining it from Dennis Peron's Cannabis Club in downtown San Francisco before it was closed. So we designed a clinical trial, Rick Doblin and myself, and sent it off. It was really readily approved by the Food and Drug Administration, surprisingly. The University of California Institutional Review Board had 4 pages of issues that I addressed. Ultimately, the question became obtaining marijuana for the study, and we needed to go to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, where Alan Leshner was the director at that time. Alan and I have a correspondent that's on the World Wide Web. It gives me a number of Google hits. But basically, he sent me back a letter after 9 months having reviewed my proposal and said that he was sorry that he could not provide us with the marijuana for this clinical trial because the study was not scientific. Here it had been approved by the FDA, by the University of California, and controlled substance studies in California also need to be approved by the California Research Advisory Panel, or CRAP. CRAP actually, because I've told this story so much, CRAP has changed their name to the Research Advisory Panel of California, so I can't make that little joke. Anyway, it was a little bit upsetting to me that Alan Leshner called our study unscientific when all these other bodies had approved it. Turned out later on, Alan and I became somewhat friendly, and he explained to me that something I didn't realize. The National Institute on Drug Abuse has a mandate from Congress to study substances of abuse as substances of abuse and not to provide them to researchers who want to study these substances for potential medical benefit. As he said, Donald, we're the National Institute on Drug Abuse, not for drug abuse. So Alan Leshner, before he left. Anyway, so ultimately, in 1996, HIV changed because protease inhibitor drugs became available that could really suppress the virus. The wasting syndrome disappeared. This was the year that we in California voted for Proposition 215. And if you recall, at the end of the year, Barry McCaffrey, flanked by Donna Shalala and Janet Reno, got up there on December 30th, 1996, and said, no, 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 physicians in California and Arizona cannot talk to their patients about use of marijuana because we will do all these terrible things to them. And that's when physicians finally began to mobilize. The National Institutes on Health got together, the Institute of Medicine began to investigate this, and everybody said we need more research. Having already written 2 proposals, we were ready to write a third. And the availability of protease inhibitors gave us a new twist, because these drugs are metabolized in the liver by the same system that metabolizes cannabis. So we proposed a clinical trial not to see if marijuana was effective in patients with the AIDS wasting, because AIDS wasting disappeared, but to see if it was safe for people on protease inhibitors to smoke marijuana, fearing that there may be some sort of a drug-drug interaction between cannabis and their drugs, or cannabis and their immune system, because there was all this concern about what effect marijuana has on the immune system. This was successful. And in 1997, we were awarded $1 million and 1,400 of the government's finest 3.95% THC-containing marijuana cigarettes. We conducted a clinical trial from 1998 to 2000 in which we enrolled 67 patients and housed them in our inpatient General Clinical Research Center at San Francisco General Hospital for 25 days. 1/3 of the patients took Marinol, which is synthetic delta-9 THC. 1/3 took Marinol placebo, and 1/3 smoked a NIDA cigarette 3 times a day for 21 days. Again, the end point of the study was what happens to the level of the AIDS virus in the bloodstream, with also a look at the immune system, the level of the protease inhibitors, and since we had the patients there, we were also going to see what happened to their caloric intake, their weight, and their body composition. We completed the study. The study was published, I'm happy to say, August 18th of 2003, after having been rejected by 4 major August journals. It was rejected in the Annals of Internal Medicine, it was published in the Annals of Internal Medicine, who had previously rejected it, but I appealed it because I said they had published the results of my study in a thought piece on medical marijuana the year before, and I said, here I'm sending you the original research, I think you should publish it. And after a year going back and forth about the statistics, they ultimately published the study. I will say that the first August journal that rejected it, named after a region of our country in the Northeast, one of the reviewers, the peer reviewers, said that they felt that in one paragraph rejection said that these authors sound more like activists than scientists. I was a bit shocked, and I've been rejected by that journal on a number of times, and I said, you know, this is a bit biased, and I would be, if I were you, ashamed to have sent this to an investigator, a letter that's so politically biased and rejecting this paper on the basis of that. The reviewer's comments, when a paper goes out for peer review, peers review it and send back the comments. And the reviewer's comments in all the journals that rejected the paper were quite favorable. I think it was the editors of these journals that were concerned about publishing a study that showed our results being that there was no impact on the HIV viral load, that there was no significant drug-drug interaction between cannabis and the protease inhibitors, that the patient smoking marijuana gained weight 3 kilograms compared to 1 kilogram in the placebo group, and that in fact the immune system seemed to get a little better in the people smoking compared to the people on placebo. So, anyway, the study's done, it's history, and fortunately for all of us, we live in the state of California, although who knows what's going to happen next week. But although we've heard Governor Davis sort of lambasted, he did approve or not veto John Vasconcellos' subsequent bill, which provided money to establish the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at the University of California. I have now been awarded 3 grants to study 3 different conditions in clinical trials. Currently, we are doing a study in patients with HIV and painful peripheral neuropathy, which is nerve damage leading to very severe pain in the hands and feet. Patients with peripheral neuropathy do not benefit from opioids, but they do seem to benefit from cannabinoids or cannabis. So we have just completed a pilot study, and now we're doing a randomized placebo-controlled trial of smoked marijuana versus smoked placebo. We also have a study for cancer patients who are taking opioid narcotics and still have pain. This study is looking at the interaction of cannabis and the opioid analgesics to see if together they provide an additive pain relief, which we believe they will. We're currently doing a study in women with breast cancer who have delayed nausea and vomiting secondary to their chemotherapy to see if cannabis or Marinol provides relief. And the final study that I just hung up from the FDA with this afternoon discussing is a study to look at the Volcano vaporizer as a smokeless delivery system. I believe personally that marijuana has medicinal benefit. This is not news. People have known this for 5,000 years. In fact, it is only over the last 70 years that physicians in this country could not prescribe cannabis. What I find myself in the midst of now is a somewhat Sisyphean, if that's the right word, effort to reprove that marijuana is medicine. And we live in an era of evidence-based medicine, so my goal is to produce evidence that will hopefully convince people that need to be convinced that this is a drug that benefits people who need it. Whether or not this is a possibility in our lifetimes remains unclear, but it is the goal of the work that I'm doing. With that, I'll stop, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Donald. Our next speaker is Edwin Dobb.
Thank you, David. I speak not as a medical expert or criminologist, but instead as a person whose occupation, journalism, forces him to pay attention to certain perennial questions regarding democratic citizenship. One question concerns how societal problems are identified and defined. Another concerns the people controlling the process of definition. In other words, who determines the way problems are framed, the terms that dominate public debate, the often hidden or deliberately obscured assumptions that steer and constrain solutions. The two questions are, of course, intertwined, and taken together, they constitute an inquiry into the exercise of power. Just such an inquiry is needed, I believe, to expose what may be missing or underappreciated in our approach to the use of such illegal mind-altering substances as marijuana. Judging from the language, stories, and images that dominate mainstream media, the troubles that accompany drug use can be understood in two general ways. On the one hand is the medical perspective, with its emphasis on illness, treatment, and physicians. On the other is the punitive perspective, which stresses moral weakness, punishment, the police. Note that both models are based on roughly the same assumption, that the problem springs from some form of individual inadequacy. Certainly those who actually provide the treatment or mete out the punishment may and often do hold a more complex, less exclusive view of the people in their charge, especially of the reasons why human beings make a habit of ingesting mind-altering substances. But I'm speaking here of the debate as it plays out in the public domain, the fundamental terms that define how we as a society frame the issue before us. Essentially, that's a bipolar world inhabited by sick people and bad people. It's also a relatively new world, brought into existence in 1914 with the passage of the Harrison Narcotic Act, which for the first time in this country made the use of some mind-altering substances a crime. During the past 90 years, the pendulum has swung between punishment and treatment, with punishment clearly being the preferred alternative, the one to which we devoted by far the most time and resources. Indeed, among the early consequences of the Harrison Act was the arrest of physicians who refused to stop prescribing drugs how and when they saw fit. As if there weren't enough about this wrong-headed, profoundly destructive social experiment to induce despair, consider that we are once again harassing, arresting, and incarcerating physicians who, employing not only marijuana but powerful opiates, would dare to relieve patients of excruciating, often end-of-life pain. Perhaps nothing so clearly exemplifies the worldview of those prosecuting the war on drugs than the demonization of doctors. As in the war on terrorism, the rhetoric has become wildly inflated and misleading, allowing for the exploitation of fear and ignorance and the cynical promotion of self-serving rationales for curtailing the private behavior of our neighbors. In such a politically as well as emotionally charged climate, we must choose our words carefully. For at least a generation, and under both Democratic and Republican administrations, the threat to society posed by the use of illegal substances has been deemed so grave that the only reasonable solution is one that's described in military terms. The policeman is now a warrior, and the warrior can't do his jobs if his hands are tied. Ridding the world of evil is a dirty business. Blood will be spilled. Collateral damage can't be avoided. And it's not enough. Really, it's never been enough to counter this view with one that simply replaces warriors with healers. By allowing ourselves to be seduced by the traditional bipolar scheme, and with few exceptions the mainstream media still encourages this outlook, we inadvertently ignore a more fundamental issue: rights and responsibilities in a democratic society. By insisting that the only alternative to the rhetoric of punishment is the rhetoric of treatment, we make it easier for those who believe that the war on drugs justifies placing new restrictions on the freedom of individuals. But if instead we move the discussion into a civil liberties context, the considerable and ever-growing dangers of the war itself come into focus, and the strategy of the warriors is exposed for what it is in effect, if not intention, an assault on the principles upon which the Constitution is based. At the most fundamental level, the issue isn't one of sickness versus health or bad versus good. It's what lengths do we believe the state can and should go to monitor and control the voluntary, private use of any substance, regardless of its effects upon the individual. Seen in this light, the societal problem that truly demands our attention isn't drug abuse, it's the abuse of power. Preventing the government from overstepping its bounds is probably the quintessential and enduring topic of debate in robust democratic societies. So it's no surprise that the terms were set long ago, and in this regard, never so forcefully as in John Stuart Mill's essay On Liberty, written in 1857. Since this goes to the heart of the matter, it deserves being quoted at length. Here's what Mill wrote: "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. He cannot rightfully be compelled to do so or forbear because it will be better for him to do so, because it will make him happier, because in the opinion of others to do so would be wise or even right. The implications couldn't be clearer. The state shouldn't use its police powers to punish adults for what they ingest, period. Nor, and this needs to be emphasized, should the state compel treatment. Over himself, Mills says, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. And with such sovereignty, we must remind ourselves, comes responsibility, should one person's exercise of rights lead to excess and bring harm to another. To favor legalization is not to favor a cruel free-for-all in which no one is held accountable for his actions. But once the principle of individual sovereignty is violated, all civil liberties are at risk, which is the same as saying that all citizens are at risk, which is another way of saying that as remote as the use and sale of illegal substances may seem to some, the war on drugs, like the war on terrorism, is our war, like it or not. It's being fought in our name, after all, and with our tax dollars. More to the point, a government that has no qualms about abridging the civil liberties of your pot-smoking or cocaine-snorting neighbor could just as easily show up on your doorstep with an equally unwarranted and intrusive plan to prevent you from harming yourself. Merely a partial list of the drug warriors' current assaults on liberty explains why former Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall referred to them as the drug exception to the Constitution. Ed mentioned some of these. I'm going to run through just a few just to give you a feel for how many different ways we're at risk. Here are 10 reasons why U.S. citizens should take exception to the drug exception. Restricting free speech. That's one of the primary reasons we're here this evening, of course, and I just want to note that, again, the hypocrisy of those in power who profess a distaste for governmental intrusion yet are intolerant of states' decisions in this regard. Invasion of privacy. Drug testing is now so routine that we scarcely question it. But it has severe consequences, even though it's an unwarranted invasion of privacy. No necessary connection exists between urine analysis tests and impairment, and the test can be inaccurate. Imagine getting fired, for instance, for having had a drink the previous Friday night. That's in effect what's happening. The state is monitoring and punishing private behavior that's unrelated to job performance. Violation of due process. Civil asset forfeiture, the seizure of cars, homes, and other property, has become one of the nasty little secrets of law enforcement agencies because they've grown dependent, as Ed has pointed out, grown dependent upon the proceeds generated. More alarming, though, is that despite recent reforms, property still can be seized before a person is convicted of a crime. The property needn't be involved in the facilitation of a criminal enterprise, and the burden of proof is less than that required in a criminal proceeding. Often the most serious offenders, those with a great deal of money, can bargain for leniency, further corrupting the process. Cruel and unusual punishment. Beginning with the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984, mandatory sentencing laws have greatly reduced the discretionary power of judges, leading to grossly disproportionate forms of punishment. Other disparities include those introduced under the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of the late 1980s. For example, the most egregious example, the difference in punishment for different amounts of powder cocaine and crack cocaine, 500 grams in the case of powder, 5 in the case of crack, with the same sentencing. This obviously discriminates against poor and minorities, as most of these do. Denying access to education. In 1998, a federal law was passed banning federal aid to students who've been convicted of drug crimes. Incredibly, convicted murderers and rapists are eligible for financial aid, while those convicted of marijuana or other drug charges are barred from a year to life. In the last 3 years alone, about 90,000 people have been denied aid. The law obviously discriminates against the poor, those most in need of education. Homelessness. In 1996, the Department of Housing and Urban Development enacted a one-strike and you're out policy whereby a single drug crime, on or off housing premises can result in the eviction of an entire household. Not only does this provision deny people the right to due process, which prevents one person from being punished solely because of the actions of another, it targets low-income families, those for whom the prospect of homelessness obviously is most devastating and consequential. Disenfranchisement. In 13 states, ex-felons are barred from voting for life. And in the war on drugs, as we know, thousands upon thousands of people are being convicted of felonies every year. Destruction of the social net. The Welfare Reform Act of 1996 denies for life cash assistance, food stamps, and other benefits to any person convicted of a state or federal drug offense. Now, 19 states continue to impose the ban in full, while 31 have eliminated or modified it. Once again, even murderers and rapists escape such punitive measures. And once again, the law targets the poor as well as children. According to a 2002 report by the Sentencing Project, more than 92,000 women and 135,000 children are affected by the welfare ban. Misuse of informants. Frequently, the only evidence against a defendant is the accusation of an informant. Under current rules, such informants can remain anonymous, and given the pressure on everyone involved to plea bargain, defendants often never get the opportunity to confront their accusers. A further abuse is the over-reliance on the testimony of a single biased witness. The recent case in Tulia, Texas, which most of you probably heard about, is obviously an egregious example. 12% of the black population of a town of about 5,000 people were arrested solely on the word of a corrupt undercover agent. But that was preceded in 2000 by the arrest of 15% of the black males in the town of Hearn, Texas, this time on the word of an informant who'd agreed to implicate certain individuals. All the men were innocent. Nightfall, as former Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas once said, does not come at once, neither does oppression. In both instances, there is a twilight when everything remains seemingly unchanged. And it is in such twilight that we all must be aware of change in the air, however slight, lest we become unwitting victims of the darkness. Changes in the air brought about by the war on drugs are now so numerous and troublesome that they cannot be ignored without risking deep and possibly permanent damage to the Republic. It is dusk, and vigilance is required to navigate in the fading light. This is the responsibility not of experts in law or medicine or sociology, though their skill and wise counsel are surely needed, but instead all citizens. Nor should it be left to the drug warriors who, even as we sit here tonight, are laying plans to conflate the war on drugs and the war on terrorism, concocting something called the Victory Act, which could greatly expand the government's power to seize records and conduct wiretaps, make it easier to seize property, and so on. The so-called drug problem, redefined as an abuse of power problem, dictates a very different set of solutions than those that usually dominate such discussions. And they all stem from an awareness of and willingness to fight to maintain the real locus of power in a democracy, the people. The warriors can pursue their ill-conceived war only as long as we permit them to do so, only as long as we defer to their mad vision, only as long as we view ourselves as spectators, unwitting victims, in the words of Douglas. Civil liberties cannot exist in the absence of citizens who, on the one hand, exercise them, and on the other, defend them. In the defense of liberty, no one should be arrested, charged, go to jail, or in any way suffer coercion at the hands of the state for possessing or using drugs of any kind. Besides protecting individual rights, this approach would greatly reduce corruption of law enforcement agencies and help restore the integrity of the overall judicial system.
Thank you, Ed. For those of you who have not followed it that closely, of course, the USA Patriot Act has a successor, which was termed Patriot 2, and of course, the Patriot Act was cynically named Patriot Act to appeal to the public. And when the Patriot Act began to get bad PR, of course, they changed or renamed the Patriot Act 2 to the so-called Victory Act. So that's the next thing on the horizon. Our next speaker is Robert McCune.
Thanks. I'm really delighted to be here. I think the civil liberties issues are quite important, but I'm going to change direction a little bit and focus more on some empirical questions about the effects of drug laws on drug use. I'm actually going to say very little about medical marijuana because I actually don't think medical marijuana is really what's at issue here. I think the risk of medical marijuana systems leaking marijuana into the recreational community is such a trivial problem that I find it extremely difficult to rationalize the federal government's interest in this, taken at face value. But I think clearly what the federal government's really interested in here is symbolic politics, the symbolic politics of medical marijuana, and the perception that medical marijuana is really a Trojan horse for marijuana legalization. And I think they're surely right. I think it's clear that the medical marijuana issue carries tremendous political importance. I've been tracking Gallup polls measuring opposition to marijuana legalization, and if you look back over 30 years, the opposition has been very stable among adults at 75–80% of the population. Only recently have we seen that opposition really start dropping, and I think the opposition is really starting to drop in part because the federal government has shown pretty much the same kind of political acumen that the Fox News lawyers showed when they went after Al Franken, which is the problem with going after medical marijuana as an issue is that medical marijuana really brings into focus public views about what we're actually achieving with marijuana prohibition. Jimmy Carter, when he was president, amazingly, when he was president, said penalties against a drug should not be more dangerous to an individual than the use of the drug itself, and when they are, they should be changed. Nowhere is this clearer than the laws against the possession of marijuana. So I want to open up the context a little bit by looking at, well, what would actually happen if we decriminalize marijuana, depenalize marijuana, legalize marijuana? And I come at this not as an activist telling you what to believe, but as a policy analyst, definitely not funded by the federal government, but funded by the Alfred Sloan Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, to look at this question empirically. And I've looked at this in various different angles, looking at historical evidence, cross-national comparisons, looking at experiences with alcohol and tobacco regulation, and so on. So I just want to tell you about some of the things we know, and we don't know everything we'd like to know, but the federal government has been complaining about Canada's recent decision to decriminalize marijuana and saying that they're bad neighbors, that they're poisoning our neighborhood. And the Canadians were good enough neighbors in the 1970s not to accuse us of being bad neighbors when 11 of our states decriminalized marijuana. In fact, we did it first. 11 states in the United States decriminalized marijuana, meaning specifically possession was downgraded from a felony to a misdemeanor, and it varies from state to state how this is implemented, whether there's a quantity limit or a frequency limit or so on. But and so that's one of the sources of evidence we can look at, and when we look at that evidence, we are unable to find any effect of that legal change on levels of marijuana consumption. You can't really detect any. There's one study that has shown a very small effect. Nobody else seems to get the effect. Even the study that finds an effect is very tiny. Australia, several regions of Australia have depenalized. I prefer the term depenalization because I think it's clearer. Have depenalized possession of marijuana. Both cross-sectional and longitudinal studies fail to find any effect of this on levels of marijuana use. The U.S. is increasingly isolated in marijuana policy as country after country relaxes their marijuana laws. The U.S. federal government has really been bullying other countries into trying to toe the U.S. party line for a long time, and a lot of countries are finally saying no. we're going to go our own way. Canada has said that. Great Britain has said that. Many regions of Germany have said that. Australia, Portugal, Italy and Spain, it's actually not well known, but Italy and Spain have already decriminalized marijuana back in the 1970s. And we don't find effects of removing penalties for possession on use. And this is a big part of what this debate is about, and this looming specter of depenalization does not look like a very serious, like it has any serious consequences. I do want to talk about distinguishing depenalization from legalization and talk a little bit about legalization. Legalization would involve actually allowing legal sales of marijuana. And here we really only have one contemporary example, and even that's not a perfect example. The Netherlands, by the letter of the law, cannabis sales are prohibited in the Netherlands. Don mentioned Amsterdam, and people laughed. A lot of my research has been in Amsterdam. It's a tough job, but somebody's got to do it. What the Dutch actually did was they have a written policy of non-enforcement of sales of up to 5 grams of marijuana. The evidence on the effect of commercial sales are very ambiguous, and it's very hard to know for sure what's happening. I will say, during the 1980s, when there was a dramatic increase in the number of coffee shops and the visibility of coffee shops, and during a period in the 80s where there was a lot of advertising by these coffee shops, the Netherlands was the only country that had rising levels of marijuana use. In Europe, the United States had falling levels during that time. I think it's not implausible that commercial promotion did lead to some increase in use. Having said that, it's very hard to find any indication that that's in any way harmed Dutch society, and in fact, levels of marijuana use in the Netherlands are now significantly lower than in the United States. The Dutch, interestingly, the reason why they allow coffee shops to sell marijuana is that a sociologist in the 1970s, a Dutch sociologist, argued that there was a gateway effect, that marijuana led to hard drug use. And the Dutch concluded that they needed to soften their marijuana laws. How did they reach this conclusion? Because they believe the causal mechanism of the gateway is that young people come into contact with hard drug users and hard drug dealers, and so they wanted to separate the markets. It seems to me, and in fact, in my book I review some evidence that the Dutch have successfully done this and that they've actually weakened the gateway. It seems to me that probably a less risky way to reform marijuana laws, if you interpret increased use as a risk, and not everyone does, would be to follow the model used in Alaska and in South Australia, which is to allow legal cultivation of a small number of plants for personal use. There's no commercial promotion involved. There's no advertising involved. And it separates the marijuana market from the hard drug market without the risk of commercial interest. And in our book, we take a very jaundiced look at the tobacco industry, gambling industry, alcohol industry, and there are a lot of problems with moneyed interests getting involved in intoxicating substance. So when we look at the looming specter of so what are the threats faced by the slippery slope of medical marijuana, I don't think that the threats are really all that serious, and it's worth looking at them directly. And I think what's happening is increasingly many countries are looking at the evidence and concluding that it's just very hard to justify an aggressive American-style war on marijuana. Thanks.
And thank you, Rob, very much. We now have plenty of time for questions. The cards are, of course, designated to different speakers or the entire panel. The first question is for Ed. What advice do you have for people just starting out in the medical marijuana dispensing business?
Actually, there are more dispensaries now than when I was arrested. and there are more dispensaries throughout California than when I was arrested. And more of these dispensaries are working in cooperation with local governments. And my advice would be, if you're going to start a dispensary, to try and make arrangements with the local government. Try to become a officer of the city, although that hasn't helped me much. Dot your I's, cross your T's in terms of business licenses, and try to work with parts of the city government other than the criminal arm. I mean, rather than the criminal justice system. They're not going to give you a hand, but city council members, if there's a public health service in the city or the county, organizations like that within the government will help you. And the other advice that I give is, remember, you're there to serve your citizens and your clients. It's not there for you, you're there for them.
The next question is for Donald Abrams. In the clinical study of cannabis, how were the subjects' immune systems improved? Was this finding statistically significant? Are any researchers looking into this further?
Yeah, good question. The CD4 lymphocytes are the cell that the AIDS virus infects. It's the helper cell of our immune system, and as HIV progresses, the number of these cells decline. The CD8 lymphocytes are the suppressor cytotoxic cells which fight virally infected cells. This number, a high number, is associated with people who are the so-called long-term non-progressors. What we saw in the group that smoked marijuana was a very highly statistically significant increase in CD8 cells compared to the placebo group. We also saw a CD4 increase that was significant but not as highly statistically significant as the CD8 increase. So we saw immune system benefits on both of those parameters, but in a number of other more extensive immune system studies that we did, we saw no real difference between the three groups.
The next question is for Ed Dobb. Mainstream news media typically strive for balance and feel they've done their job if they give equal weight to both sides. What is your, do you see any way to get the mainstream press to do more probing and more real reporting?
Certainly, through this sort of activity. I'm a full-time working journalist, independent, and I think by my participation in forums like this, I can have an effect on other writers. I can have some impact on the way issues are framed. I think it's simply a matter of, in terms of writers and editors campaigning for the type of story and the approach to a story that more clearly defines the stakes.
Okay. Question for Rob McCune. How can we overturn marijuana laws in the U.S. while being a signatory to international drug treaties?
Let me swallow my ice cube first. That's a very good question. Actually, these international treaties are one reason why the Dutch have not legalized marijuana. They've come up with this elaborate way of de facto legalizing it because they're signatories to these international conventions. Now, conventions can be renegotiated. In the early 90s, I went to a European Union conference it was a meeting to harmonize drug policies. What harmonizing drug policies meant at that meeting was bring the Dutch in line. And the Dutch were really being bullied at that meeting. Now, almost a decade later, we see many of the old adversaries of the Dutch in this battle really moving in the Dutch direction. And as Europe is changing, Australia, Canada are changing, I think we're going to see movement internationally that there's this belief in American exceptionalism, and it may well be that American federal government doesn't care what other countries are doing. But one thing that I think is important is that some of these other ways of dealing with marijuana will no longer just be hypothetical. We'll actually have experience with those, and we'll find out what happens. And so far, as we're accumulating evidence, we find out that not much happens. The sky does not fall in, and I think that that's potentially important.
Another question for Ed Rosenthal. Where is the tipping point in this drug war?
I think the tipping point has already occurred. And the tipping point was when, has occurred over a period of time as citizens in 8 states voted overwhelmingly for medical marijuana. And when we heard in the polls that between 60 and 75% of the population is in favor of it. We've tipped in terms of medical marijuana, and it's just that right now the tail is wagging the dog. It's not going to be happening for long. And one of the things that the book, The Tipping Point, talks about is that things will go along on a plateau for a while, but when things start happening, they happen quickly. And in our lifetime, that's happened any number of times. One day we woke up and the Soviet Union was no longer. We had apartheid in our country. There are a number of major changes. There was no gambling in this country. There was only one state that had gambling, and now that's an accepted practice. So I think that we have actually tipped, and we're going to see a rapid change in this, probably with the new administration in Washington.
A number of questions which I'll direct to the entire panel, and this is regarding the question of what do patients or individuals with terminal illness do to alleviate pain and live outside of, who either live in or outside of California. We're talking about people with Crohn's and ALS and many other ailments if the feds are breathing down the neck of clubs and so forth. What can these individuals do? Who can they turn to? Do you want to start? Yeah?
Actually, let me give a non-medical opinion on this, which I think it's extremely hard to justify prosecution of people using marijuana for medical use. But I think we also have to be clear that the evidence is the risk of arrest and prosecution for someone using marijuana medicinally or otherwise is quite small. About the probability of arrest for all marijuana users in a year of using is about 3%, and for medical patients who are using it medically, the risk is certainly lower than that. Basically, there are a lot of people in states without medical marijuana laws who are already obtaining marijuana and using it.
I'm afraid we just have time for one last question. And this is for the whole panel. And this relates to the point that was mentioned earlier, that all of the major candidates in the recall election have endorsed medical marijuana. What can a new governor of California do to stop the federal campaign against medical marijuana? Ed?
Okay, I think that the new governor could come in and start defending, use the state resources to defend medical marijuana users and their suppliers, and say, well, if the federal government is coming in, we're going to defend these people. And I think that the federal government would back off because they'd never, ever be able to get a conviction again.
I think if a state politician really started, especially a governor, really started contesting the federal government on this, I think it would be, really be a very serious political consequence for the federal government, and would really risk undermining support for the federal government's position on marijuana. it's striking how few this is truly remarkable that we have all these candidates endorsing medical marijuana. When we wrote our book, we couldn't find any politicians in office to cite as being in favor of marijuana reform other than Mark Morial, the mayor of New Orleans at the time, and Kurt Schmoke, mayor of Baltimore. Otherwise, there were no politicians on record as favoring drug reform of any kind.
I want to thank Ed Rosenthal for his superb work and truly courageous leadership. We're indebted to Ed, and as Ed has said, it's just a matter of time. I also want to thank our speakers, Donald Abrams, Edwin Dobb, and Robert McCune, for the really excellent presentations and taking the time to join us for this program tonight. We're especially grateful to our co-sponsors, Harper's Magazine, the Drug Policy Alliance, and the Goldman School at UC Berkeley for their marvelous assistance. And most of all, I want to thank each of you for joining with us. Without you, this program wouldn't have been such a success, and the movement that we're discussing cannot possibly succeed. As I mentioned earlier, Ed and Rob will be available in the outer lobby. We hope that each of you will pick up copies of their books. Anyone seriously interested in this issue cannot do any harm, I can say the least, and I strongly encourage you to get their books, and they'd be happy to autograph them for you. Please also visit our website at independent.org for upcoming information about our events. We look forward to seeing you at our next Independent Policy Forum. Thank you and good night.